Alright, today we're going to talk about video number 2's worksheet that goes with it. If you haven't seen the video already, you can go ahead and click up here in the little box and you can find that. Today we're going to be talking about pronouns and conjugation in the German language. And to start off, we need to figure out, first of all, what are the pronouns in English, and then translate them into German. And then, in order to figure out the conjugation, we need to find what verb endings go with each of these. We're going to start off with the English pronoun I. In German, we have the word ich. If you want to say I in German, you just say ich. If you're going to say something like this, you're going to need a verb ending. And contrary to what you have in Spanish, where you have different endings for ER, IR, and AR verbs, here in the German language, we have one set of endings for all verbs. Most of the verbs are going to end in an N or an EN. And so we start off here with the ending here as an E. For example, in the verb gehen, gehen is to go in German, and it would be ich gehe. So we took off our ending here of the EN, and we added our E to the end of that word, and so we now have the conjugated form ich gehe, I am going. The you singular informal, and contrary to what we have in English we just have you. There's no formal or informal or plural or singular, it's just you. And so this could be talking to many people, could be talking to your boss, it could be a single person, all kinds of other options in English. But in German, we have three different yous. We have the you singular informal, then we also have the you plural informal, and the you singular or plural formal. So the informal one is what we call du. It's the most common one, it's the one that you're going to hear the most often, and that's du. If you want to conjugate a verb to go with that, you're going to have an ST at the end of it. So in our example before, we have du gehst. Du gehst, you go. Or you can say, gehst du, are you going? He, or the masculine it. Now this is something that we don't really come across in English. We have the masculine it, because we have nouns that take genders, and these genders have to agree with the pronouns whenever you use them. So for instance, der Tisch, the table. It's der Tisch, and since it's a masculine noun, we have to use the masculine it when we're referring to it as a pronoun, so we would use er. So if I'm saying the table is brown, der Tisch ist braun, then you're going to have that as a pronoun and say it is brown in English, but in German we would say er ist braun. That's why we have here the masculine it. That's er. And in German, in order to conjugate our verb, we have to have here a T at the end of our verb. So in this case, we would have er geht. The she or the female it, same example as before, we would now have the word sie. And Z is confusing because you're going to see it several times on this chart, but we're going to leave it alone for right now until we get the rest of them put up there. But if you had another example of a feminine noun, so for example, die Tür is the door, and it is obviously a feminine noun since it says die Tür. So we would have to say things like die Tür ist braun, the door is brown. If we wanted to say this as it is brown, sie ist braun, because it has to be a feminine form. This one is also going to take a T here for the form, so it's going to take the same form of the verb as the er form, and we're going to have er geht. Then we have one that's it all by itself, and that is S, and that's for neuter nouns. So in English, this is what we kind of default to whenever we think about it, but this only works for neuter nouns. So things like das Büro, that would be the office, and you would have to say something like Es ist da drüben, it is over there. And the conjugation of the verb is the same for that form, so we still have es geht. And if you remember, we had the word es geht, or wie geht's, where how is it going? That's geht es, and the reason that we conjugated it as gate is because of the word es, because that's our subject of that sentence. Now the next one we have is we, which would be wir in German, and wir takes an en at the end of it, which means that most of the time, the verb that you find in the dictionary is probably going to be the same form that you have for the wir form, and that is wir gehen, we go. Now, the next you that we have on our list is you plural informal. So basically, if you have more than one du, you would have ihr. So your friend and another friend, that would be ihr. And in order to conjugate our verb here, we have to have a T again. So we have geht. They is where it starts to get confusing, and that is because we have sie again here. So we have she feminine as sie, but we also have they as sie. And this one is going to take an en on the verb, contrary to what you had for the she form, and so we end up going back to our form of gehen, sie gehen. And to make things even more complicated, we have yet another z down here at the bottom. This one is capitalized and therefore shows you a little bit of a difference here. If it's at the beginning of a sentence, however, it's not going to help you any. You're going to have to kind of figure that out by the context. But we have the singular or plural, so this could be your boss or several bosses. So if you have several managers that are over you, you would say Sie to all of them, or just one of them, it would still be Sie. This is only used, however, with addressing people, so you would say you. Anytime that you would say you in English, you would say you in German, and that's going to have to depend on what the context of the conversation is, but we'll have some examples of that here in a little bit. And the conjugation is the same as the they form, so we have here gehen. So, if we were going to conjugate our verb, I always go down the conjugation and say each pronoun followed by the form of the verb. So, something like ich gehe, du gehst, sie, es geht. And notice that I combine those three so that we have all three forms together at the same time, rather than saying geht, sie geht, es geht. It's just kind of redundant. So I say sie, es geht. Wir gehen, ihr geht, sie gehen, sie gehen. And here we have some examples of verbs. We need to conjugate each of these verbs to go with each form. And you'll notice that in the conjugation chart, I did combine sie, and es because they're the same, and these two z's down here at the bottom so that I don't have to keep writing the same thing over and over again. So, in the first one here, we have kommen, which means to come. So, we take off the en as our first step, and then we have to conjugate our verb to go with each pronoun. If you remember from before, we have here an e, an st, a t, en, t, en. And some of my students will tell you that it's icky dust 10-10, which is ik, e, du, and st makes dust 10-10. T-E-N, T-E-N. Icky dust 10-10. That's kind of their way of remembering which forms go with what. I used to do the est, T-E-N, T-E-N. It just kind of flowed better for me, but that was just my version. So, kommen, you would just drop your en, add all of these endings to it, so you have ich komme, du kommst, sie, es kommt, wir kommen, ihr kommt, sie kommen, sie kommen. And notice that I don't separate the last ones. That's just a force of habit of mine. I always say it that way, and I can't really pinpoint why I do it that way. Next example that we have is schreiben, and again we're going to drop the en at the end of it to make it just schreib. And then we're going to have to add our endings to each one. Ich schreibe, du schreibst, sie, es schreibt, wir schreiben, ihr schreibt, und sie schreiben. The next one over, we have spielen, which is to play, as in ich spiele Klavier, I play piano, ich spiele Gitarre, I play guitar, and so on. And you would do the same thing, you dropped your en, and then you have to add your endings. Ich spiele, du spielst, sie, es spielt, wir spielen, ihr spielt, sie spielen, sie spielen. And this last one we already did up there at the top, so we're going to skip that one, being as that would be a little redundant. Now here we have a few more examples of verbs, and this time we have a few examples of some exceptions to rule. So, first of all, drop our en like we do with every verb for reden, for to speak, and then we have to add our endings. So we would have ich rede. Du, you would think, is supposed to be du redst. You would just add an st to the end of it. However, because this ends in a d for the stem, so the part whenever you drop the en, the stem would then be the letters that are left. If the last letter of that is a d, we have to add an extra e here, and then an st. So it's du redest. Du redest. It's a little bit easier to say that way rather than trying to say du redst. That would just be awkward. So, same thing happens here in the sie, es form. There we have sie, es redet. In the wir form, we already have an e at the end of our verb because we're going to say wir reden, so we just leave it as wir reden. Because the ihr form takes the same ending as the sie, es form, we're going to have the same rule here, and we have ihr redet. And then the sie form again is the same, sie reden. Arbeiten, here we have an en, so we drop that off of there, and then we add our endings. We have ich arbeite. And then the same thing as before, where we had the st, we had to add an extra e between a d. The same thing happens here with the t, so we would say du arbeitest. So we had to add an extra one there because otherwise we couldn't pronounce the word properly. Now for the sie, es form, we do the same thing. Here we have arbeitet, arbeitet. Wir, we have no problem here. We just say wir arbeiten. The ihr form, again, we have to add that extra e. And then the last form here is again the same as the infinitive, arbeiten. So it's ich arbeite, du arbeitest, sie, es arbeitet, wir arbeiten, ihr arbeitet, sie arbeiten, sie arbeiten. Atmen. Here we have to drop our en at the end of it. It's to breathe. So you would say ich atme, I breathe. Du Again, we would think that you would have to have just atmest, but that's too difficult to say. So even whenever I tried to mispronounce it, I still end up adding that extra syllable there with the E. So that's exactly what we do. Du atmest. You breathe. Sie atmet. Wir atmen. Ihr atmet. Und sie atmen. Sie atmen. So here are some examples that we would use to add an extra E. If you have a D or a T at the end of the verb stem, you would add an E for the du, RCS, and ihr forms. If you have a consonant cluster or a couple of consonants together, usually a consonant followed by an M or an N, you're going to have to add an extra E. This does not count whenever you have two M's, as we saw in the example above, kommen, but it does count whenever you have a consonant that is not the same as the next consonant. Then you're going to have to add an E. Things like whenever it rains, es regnet. There we have GN at the end of the verb stem, and so we have to add an E for it is raining, es regnet. Now for our next example, we have here reisen, and again, if you just drop the EN, we have here reis, and then we have to add our ending. So, ich reise, du. Now because we have an S already at the end of the stem, we don't add an extra S to the end of the verb here, so we just say du reist. And for those of you who are thinking, wouldn't that just make the RCS and the ihr forms the same verb? Yes. So the conjugation is RCS reist, wir reisen, ihr reist, sie reisen. So, if the verb ends with an S, you have to not add an S here. And this is why we call this the STD rule. We call this the STD rule because we have S's, T's, and D's, or things that act like S's, T's, and D's, that would take extra little special care. So for anything that ends in a D or a T, or something that acts like that, or if it's just complicated to pronounce, we add an extra syllable by adding an E in between the stem of the verb and the ending. If the verb ends in an S for the stem of the verb, we would add just a T for the do form. That's the only special thing about things that end in S's. Now there are some consonants that have the same rule that you would have for the S's, things like S-sets, which is basically a double S, or two S's, which is exactly a double S, or a Z, which in the German language is set, which you can tell has kind of an S sound to it, and therefore you don't have to add an extra S there. So, we have the example heißen, to be called, as in ich heiße, I am called. So you would just say ich heiße, and then your name for introducing yourself. Ich heiße Bob. Du. Because we have here an S set, we don't add an extra S there, we just say du heißt, as in wie heißt du? How are you called? What's your name? The same form then for the do form is the RCS form as well. So we have RCS heißt, wir heißen, ihr heißt, sie heißen, sie heißen. Next thing on there is küssen. Küssen is to kiss, and you would have, again, two S's there, so there's not a point in adding a third S. So all of the other forms are the same. We just have ich küsse, du küsst, RCS küsst, wir küssen, ihr küsst, und sie küssen. Tanzen has the same effect here. We don't add an extra S at the end of the verb for the do form, so we just say ich tanze, du tanzt, RCS tanzt, wir tanzen, ihr tanzt, sie tanzen. Zeichnen goes back to our previous example when we have a consonant stuck together with a consonant. So here, if we drop our EN, we have CHN, Zeichen. And then if you add your endings to that, the normal ones stay normal. Ich zeichne, du zeichnest, RCS zeichnet, wir zeichnen, ihr zeichnet, und sie zeichnen. Now we have a few more examples here. We have finden, to find. Obviously, if you take off the EN here, we have find, which obviously ends in a D, so we have the STD rule in play here. So we say ich finde, I find. Du findest, you find. RCS findet, wir finden, ihr findet, sie finden. Antworten, to answer. If we drop the EN there, we obviously end in the T. And so we have to say, ich antworte, du antwortest, RCS antwortet, wir antworten, ihr antwortet, sie antworten. Besuchen. You have two consonants together, but because they make one sound, you don't add an extra sound here. So we just have Besuch, and then we conjugate normally. Ich besuche, I visit. Du besuchst, you visit. RCS besucht, wir besuchen, ihr besucht, sie besuchen. Bringen, to bring. Drop your en, you have a G at the end of it, and while you do have two consonants again, this is still one sound, bring, and so we don't actually add an extra syllable here, so we just have ich bringe. Du bringst. Sie es bringt, wir bringen, ihr bringt, sie bringen. Now in this form, we're supposed to put in the right pronoun in the German language for each of these things. So, it says in parentheses here that we are talking about a child, das Kind. So, if we're talking about it, obviously in English we would use it. Because we have the word das here, we know that this is a neuter noun, and because of that we have to use the neuter pronoun even though the child is actually probably going to have a gender. So we say here, es. If the children are plural, we would have here die Kinder. And since it's them, we have to use sie. So if we're saying the children are going, sie gehen. Der Hund, which is a dog. When we're talking to a dog, which one do we use? Obviously we would be using a you, but we have three different yous. It's one person, or one thing here, that we're using as you, and so we say you singular. But we now have two forms of that, so is it either du or sie? Obviously a dog is not your superior, and therefore we would say du. If you're talking to any of your pets, you use du. Die Katze, when you're talking about it. Here we have again die Katze, and we're talking about it. If it's it in English, we have to discern which it we have to use in German. Here we have die Katze, which tells us it's a feminine noun, and so we use here sie. Der Mann, when talking about him. Der Mann is a masculine noun, says der right there. And since it's Mann, we have to use him or he. And since we're going to talk about he is going to the store or something like that, geht. Die Frau, when talking about her. Same concept here. We have a feminine noun using her, or in this case she, so we would say sie, as in sie geht. Der Mann und ich, the man and I. If it's the man and I, we would have to use we. The man and I, we go to the store. Wir gehen. Du und ich, you and I. You and I make up we, which is again still wir. Der Mann, du und ich. The man, you and I. If that's the case, it's still wir. Deine Mutter. You're talking to your mother. Because she's a blood relative of yours, you're going to use the informal you. Obviously, she's a singular individual, and singular informal then is du. Der Polizist. You're talking to a police officer. In the interest of not getting a ticket, you're going to use the Sie form here. Sie, being polite. Der Tisch, when talking about it. That's the example I gave earlier. Der Tisch, being a masculine noun, we have to use when talking about it, as in ist braun. Die Tür, talking about the door. That was the example I gave earlier. Die Tür, being a feminine noun, we have to use sie. Das Fenster, the window. If you're talking about it, the it has to be the neuter it, es. Your friends, Bob and Jim, when you're talking about them. If it's them, it's they in the nominative case, and we would say sie, they. If you're talking about a police officer, you're not talking to him. You don't have to worry about whether it's formal or informal. You're talking about a police officer, and you would say in English, he, He is nice. Ist nett. If you're talking to your friends, Bob and Jim, since they're your friends, you're obviously going to use the informal form. So, if it's Bob and Jim, they're more than one person, and therefore we have to use plural, informal, ihr. Your friend Bob, when you're talking about him. Obviously, if it's Bob, and you're saying, he's a nice guy. In English, you would say he. In German, you would say er. If you're talking about yourself, you're going to say ich, I. I do this, I do that, ich. Your friend Bob, when you're talking to him. If it's a friend of yours, obviously he's a singular person, it's just Bob, so you're going to have to use you, but you have to use the informal form because it's a friend of yours. Therefore, we use here du. In this section, we're supposed to fill in the blanks with the correct form of the verb in parentheses. So, after each sentence, we have a verb, and we're supposed to drop the en and add the ending appropriately, based on what the subject of the sentence is. So, Nummer 1. Something du gern. In any given German sentence, you're going to more than likely have on either side of the verb is going to be where the subject is. There isn't anything in front of the verb here, so the subject has to be after the verb. So here we have du. Du is always the subject. If it's not the subject, it becomes other things. It changes based on what case it is, and we'll get to cases later. But du is the subject in this sentence, so we have to conjugate our verb to go with du. Tanz is our base form, so we put that here first, tanz. Because it ends in a Z, which acts as an S, we have to just add a T. Du tanzt. This sentence says, tanzt du gern? Do you like to dance? Nummer 2. Using the same logic we had before, there's nothing in front of the blank, which means that what comes after the blank is our subject. So in this sentence we have ihr, form of reisen, drop your en, and add your ending. For the ihr form, it's a t. Ihr reist. Reist ihr nach Europa? Are you traveling to Europe? Nummer 3. Again, nothing in front of the blank, which means what comes after the blank here is the subject. Notice that the Z here is capitalized, which means that we have to use the formal version, schreiben, which is the same as the infinitive form. Schreiben Sie ein E-Mail? Are you writing an email? Nummer 4. Das Kind, something, seine Oma. Here we have a blank in the middle, which means that we have an object here and an object here. So we have to figure out who's doing the visiting, which is what besuchen means. Is it the child is visiting his grandmother, or is the grandmother visiting the child? The word order here could be a little bit fuzzy, but because logic would dictate that the child is going to see the grandmother, we're going to say that the child is the subject. It's really quite irrelevant that the child is actually the subject, because seine Oma would take the same conjugation. It's still the er sie es form, and so we say, das Kind besucht. Das Kind besucht seine Oma. The child visits his grandmother. Nummer 5. Here we have a noun on this side of the blank and a prepositional phrase on the other, which means the only thing that can be the subject here is das Mädchen. Das Mädchen is the girl, which means that it's the er sie es form. If we replace that with a pronoun, we would say she. She works at a company in the city. Sie, or in this case es, das Mädchen, arbeitet bei einer Firma in der Stadt. The girl works at a company in the city. Der Mann, something, den Hund. Here we have der Mann and den Hund. Der Mann is nominative case. Den Hund is accusative case. That's what happens with a masculine noun. When it's the direct object, it changes to den, which is going to be in a different video coming up. Der Mann tells us that that's the subject of the sentence because it says der instead of den. Therefore, we conjugate our verb küssen to go with the man. Der Mann küsst. The man kisses the dog. Der Mann küsst den Hund. Nummer 7. Die Kellnerin. Die Kellnerin, something, eine Blume. The waitress is drawing a flower. Here we have zeichnen, which if we drop our en, we have an n at the end of there that has a consonant in front of it, which means we have to add an extra syllable for die Kellnerin zeichnet. Die Kellnerin zeichnet eine Blume. The waitress is drawing a flower. Nummer 8. Something, mich, hässlich. Here we have which is the subject of the sentence, and he. Finden, if we take off the en, ends in a d, which means for the er sie es form, we have to add an extra syllable. Findet mich hässlich. He finds me ugly, or he thinks I'm ugly. Ich, something, gern, Fußball. Ich is the subject because ich is always the subject. There are no exceptions to this. If ich is in the sentence, it has to be the subject. Otherwise it becomes other things like mich and mir. So for instance in English when we say, I am going to the store, I is the subject in that sentence because I can't be anything other than the subject. If it were not the subject, such as he is hitting me is the direct object there, and therefore is me as opposed to I. The same thing happens in German, where we have ich. Ich is always the subject, so we know that our conjugation of spielen, we drop our en, and we add our ending, ich spiele. Ich spiele gern Fußball. I like to play soccer. Nummer 10. Ich. As I just mentioned, ich is always the subject, which means that this has to have the ich form again. Drop the en on reden, and we have ich rede. Ich rede zu viel. I talk too much. Mein Bruder und ich, something, einen Kuchen zur Party. As I mentioned before, ich has to be the subject, but here we have something special. We have und. Und means and. So this says, my brother and I. My brother and I would be combined into a different pronoun. If we were to say my brother and I, to replace it with one single pronoun, we would have to say we. So we would use the we form or the wir form of bringen, which is wir bringen. Wir bringen einen Kuchen zur Party. We are bringing a cake to the party. Nummer 12. Sie. This one says that it's plural. The plural form is the base form of the verb as well. So we have sie kommen. Sie kommen aus Deutschland. They come from Germany. Nummer 13. This one says that it's singular. The singular form, obviously, is the she form. So we have to use here the sie form that goes with the er sie es form, which takes a t. But if we drop our en at the end of the verb, we notice that we already have a t there, which means we have to add an extra syllable. Sie antwortet. And we added an e in between the stem and the ending. Nummer 14. Wie something du. Here we have do in the sentence, and do is always the subject. It will change if it's not. So we have here the do form of heißen, which would take an s and a t. But if you notice, when we take off the en, we have here an s set, which acts like an s because it's basically two s's put together. So we have wie heißt du. Wie heißt du? What is your name, or how are you called? Nummer 15. Wir something tief und ohne Angst. Here we have the wir form, which is basically the same form as the infinitive. So we just say wir atmen. We breathe deeply and without fear. Wir atmen tief und ohne Angst. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you want to see the next video in this series of worksheet explanations, go ahead and click on that little box right there. If you want to see the next video of German with puppets, click there. And if you want to see the previous video of worksheet explanations, click in that first box there. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time, bye.